Today is the 27th of March 2017 and I'm here to interview Moniek Garber. Moniek, could I begin by asking you when you were born?
Yeah, 10/12/23.
And where?
The town is Wolozhin. It is along a well-established old cattle drive, somewhat from more or less central, what today would be Belarus, leading through Vilna towards Riga, actually. It was obviously exporting cattle. It was you translate Wolozhin as ox drive, so it is an ancient route. I don't know how old the town is.
At that time, was that in Poland?
That was Poland, yes.
So when you were born there, were the people in the town mainly Polish?
No, mainly Jewish.
What sort of percentage?
Yeah, let's say the town was about 8,000 people. I would say about 6,000 Jews. And the rest were Poles and people to whom they refer today as Belarus. They used to call themselves Tuteishi, meaning actually local. What is the difference? The language lies somewhere on the borders between Polish and Russian. So.
And what did you speak at the time?
Well, the Jewish people spoke Yiddish. So I spoke Yiddish, but I also spoke Polish and I also spoke Russian. Now, if you say to me, when did you learn it? I can't really say. I sort of absorbed it. All I can tell you is that when I was eventually the concentration camps, the Russian peasantry who were there in the camps used to refer to me as Moskvich. That means a lot from Moscow, because I spoke, what you would call like good Russian or a literary Russian.
And what was your life like in those early years?
Well, most of the Jewish people were in one way or another, either in a business or in a trade. And our family was pretty well established in the town. So we had warehouses, basically. In Poland, spirits were a government monopoly. So, for instance, my grandmother was entitled to be selling spirits. So we sold not beer, spirits and wines and things. So we had a place and we just sold spirits and wines, both retail and wholesale. And my father also wholesaled all kinds of things like flour and sugar and things of that kind.
And did you mix with the Polish people who lived around
Yes,
you?
indeed. We mixed with the Polish people. The town at one time had a kind of, the landlord, people called Tiszkiewicz, at one time they lived in the town, and then they sold their sort of mansions to the Polish government, and it became a garrison for the army. So the town was also an army garrison. but we pretty well mixed with the population, yes.
And I think you came from a very ancient religious family.
Religious, yes. The ancestors were linen merchants, and linen is bleached in the sun, and to keep the clothes clean. There were huge lawns behind the house. We had a large amount of land behind our building. What I know from documentation is, in 1740, an ancestor of mine called Heimer built the local synagogue. And the synagogue was sort of at the very edge of the land that belonged to the family. And then in those days, rabbis were people who simply sort of knew enough about the Torah to be able to, shall we say, to make some use of it. Another thing has to be remembered, and that is that in Poland, rabbis were also part of the judicial system, so that there were also judges. So, for instance, I remember that one of my ancestors had a lot of daughters, and they were married to the judge of so-and-so and the judge of so-and-so. What it basically meant is they were married to rabbis. If you wonder where I have the information from, is partly from some New York institution that keeps these informations, kind of genealogical society.
And did you have any brothers or sisters?
Any?
Any brothers or sisters?
Yeah, I had an older brother. He was 6 years older. He was a pianist. And during the war, our part of Poland was in the east of the country. So after about a week or 10 days of the German invasion, the Red Army came into our parts of the country, and it became the Soviet Union. So it's sort of, we found us, anyway, by 1940, I was arrested, and
Tell me why did that happen?
right. The Soviet Union was planning elections which were going to include our part of the country into the Soviet Union. They were to be held in March, I remember that, March 1940. And there were placards being displayed, and one had a cut-out head of Stalin. And whoever did it, it wasn't properly glued on, so it was sort of fluttering, so I removed that fluttering bit. That meant that I damaged a piece of placard. Because of that, I was arrested and interviewed.
Did you do it on purpose?
No, I did it because some misguided idea of neatness, I suppose. It was sort of flying around.
So what happened then when you were arrested?
Well, we were kept for a while in the cellars of the mansions, and I remember the cell I was in. Before I was in it, I was Maria Tiszkiewicz, that means that the landowner's family were also somehow naturally arrested. I don't know what happened to them. And then in stages, I was transported eventually to Moscow through several prisons on the way. Well, at least one definitely, which I remember. And on the way I started getting used to a variety of frightening realities and things like lice and bugs, which I didn't know before. And I was then sent from a prison in Moscow called the Taganka. And I remember mentioning to someone who was in Moscow, sort of in recent years, he said, that's a theater, which means that the old prison was probably eventually demolished, and there was a theater on the site. But when I was in Moscow in 1940, it was a massive, huge prison, and there is a reason why it was called Taganka, because in the shape of the letter T in Old Russian, and that's, they've changed the alphabet in Russia. The letter T is now spelled or written the same way as in the West, but the original Cyrillic alphabet, it was a kind of a line with 3 legs. And so the 3 legs, that's why it was called Taganka, I'm sure of it, because 3 long corridors with prison cells along them. My guess would be that the prison held some 20,000 prisoners, I would say. The cells were probably originally built for 1 or 2, but they held up to 15, 20 people per cell. And we sort of, during the day, we sat against the walls, shoulder to shoulder on both sides. And at night, you just lowered yourself. So it was very...
And did your family know where you were at this time?
Yes, well, I know that my father and my brother somehow knew where I was, because years later, a year later, when I was already in the concentration camps near the White Sea, if you look at the map, you'll see where it is. I received a parcel from them, so obviously they knew where I was.
And how long were you in the prison in Moscow?
How many?
How long were you in the prison in Moscow?
About 2 or 3 months, because in between it, I was sent to a camp somewhere a good distance south of Moscow, possibly as far as the Ukraine, and to a camp for youth. But the camp commandant refused to allow me in because I was political. So I was sent back to the prison, to a different prison in Moscow, where I remember being locked up in a cupboard. Rather, it's a good thing I'm not subject to claustrophobia. But anyway, eventually from there we were sent first to a camp near the top of a lake called Ladoga. It's sort of maybe 150 miles from Finland, the Finnish border. And that reminds me that in 1939, not only did the Germans invade Poland, but the Soviet Union early in 1939, invaded Finland and removed quite a bit of Finnish territory. So in 1941, I was still in the camp, and then the Finns decided to try and get the territory back. So to avoid that, we were evacuated further east, and we walked for about 3 weeks to a month to camps to the east of the White Sea. Quite extensive sort of areas of camps. The area used to be afforested, but so much forest was cut down that sort of turns into kind of tundra, deserted kind of territory. The forests are cut down but not replanted. And many years later, the first Soviet space flights were actually directed from that particular camp. They were later moved to a more southern location. Apparently these northern territories are not so suited for space flights.
And what did you do there once you were in this camp?
Right. I worked in the forest. I was too young and probably too unskilled to fell trees. So some more experienced men would fell the trees, and I would cut off the branches and saw off this kind of work.
And were you given enough food?
35 grams of bread a day. That's all. That's it. That's what it meant. That's the food. 35 grams of black bread or brown bread. It was insufficient to keep you fully fed, so you slowly lost weight. Some men who lost weight more quickly sort of probably died of it. Because of the northern territory, there was actually very little infectious diseases like colds and things like this. What people suffered from is scurvy. And I remember people with severe scurvy, which is very frightening to look at, because they lose the skin and most of their body.
And were you the youngest person in the camp?
I was either the youngest or there was another Tatar who was about my age, or maybe a year older. But I was nearly the youngest.
And did you know what was happening in the rest of Poland at the time?
No, but I mentioned the fact that we were taken east. Before we were taken, all the prisoners were gathered, and it was read out to us that our motherland was invaded by the Germans, and we are going to fight them, and so on and so on. And it was signed by Kaganovich and Molotov. And so people saw that Stalin was dead, and there was a degree of relief in the camp about that. But Kaganovich took over from Stalin because Stalin had a nervous breakdown. Stalin was subject to this kind of, when we saw photographs of Stalin, who always looked as a pretty sturdy man, but in fact he was a very ill man. He had a shrunk left arm, virtually immobile, and he was subject to nervous sort of episodes. He used to get a, you know, when the Germans were invaded, I'm quite sure Stalin thought they would be shot, but he shot so many others, there was nobody left to do the thing. Anyway, Stalin survived and probably came back after 6 months or so. But in the meantime, I was released from the camps because at the time we didn't know why. But what actually happened is that Atman Kaganovich, who was the commissar for heavy industry, approached Britain for an alliance. He couldn't get an alliance because they were at war with Poland. So in some way the war was renounced. As a result, people who were Polish citizens were released from the camps. So I was among them. I was released.
And did you think of going back home at that point?
Well, the Germans were already pretty well east of there. In fact, I promised one of the people in the prison that I'll visit his wife, but she was already behind German lines, the town she lived in. In fact, the Germans were already at the gates of Moscow. So I couldn't get to Moscow either, where I had an aunt. And so I joined, I was too young to be a soldier, so I joined the Polish cadets. And eventually we were evacuated out of the Soviet Union to the Middle East. We stayed first in Tehran, and then eventually, by 1942, I was old enough to be a soldier. So we were then sort of attached to a unit which took Italian prisoners from Egypt, from Suez, and we took them to South Africa. So we sailed in a French liner from Suez to Durban in South Africa, where we left the Italian prisoners. And this reminds me that the French merchant navy joined the Allies, unlike the French military navy, which was eventually bombed in Dakar in Africa. Anyway, we stayed in South Africa in a place called Pietermaritzburg, probably for about 6 weeks to 2 months. Then we took German prisoners, again in a French boat. That's why I mentioned the fact, this time it was the Pasteur, a liner that used to go from Cherbourg to Buenos Aires, because I remember the wooden map on the lounge there. And we escorted the German prisoners around Africa, towards the coast of South America. Then the boat hugged the coast. We stopped in Rio for some food and other things, possibly fuel. And we then got to Halifax in Nova Scotia, where the German prisoners were unloaded, and American soldiers by then joined the boat, and we sailed to Scotland in convoy. We disembarked in Gourock, and I then served in a Polish unit in Dalkeith, which is a suburb of Edinburgh.
And at that time, did you learn English?
I was beginning to pick up a few words. In fact, there was a unit of, a British unit called the Cameroons, which sailed together with us at the time. And I sort of started learning some English from those people. So any English I have is not sort of learned, picked up.
Still very good.
Yeah.
And while this was happening, what was happening to your family back in Poland?
Right, my family. Now, I know that because my cousin, my uncle was also arrested several weeks before me, and his family was sent into exile. So my two cousins, a boy and a girl, were sent to Kazakhstan into exile. Now, my cousin, the male one, he went back to our town. He went to see the house in which he lived, and the granddaughter of my nanny was occupying that house. So from her he got the information, and that is that my father was shot by a German officer because he was made the Juden, or sort of Jewish leader, and he refused to select 50 people to dig trenches because he knew that he would be shot. So he apparently told the German officer to do his own dirty work. So the officer shot him. So my father was shot. My brother was professor of piano at the Minsk Conservatory. That's the Soviet authorities appointed him to do that. And he got married. I've never met his wife, of course. And they evacuated east. And so my brother survived, and my brother's family have survived in the Soviet Union. I had one contact with them, only one. They did not feel confident enough to keep contact with me.
Because they would have got into trouble?
Because Russia today is, in terms of liberality, is a continuation of the Soviet Union. The kind of the level of freedom that people have and what contacts they make is somehow still supervised. As you know from what's happening recently, just the other day, yesterday or what. So I do have my brother's family in Russia, but I don't have any contact with them. Now, my cousin's family, my aunt Ethel, she had a good sense to request a return to Polish citizenship, which she was allowed. So she went back to Poland with the two children.
After the war?
Yeah, after the war in 1949 or 50 or something like that. Anyway, she had relations in France, so they sort of evacuated themselves to France. So I have family, cousins in France and in Israel.
And after you were demobbed here in Britain, what did you do?
Well, I was a gunner, basically, in armored cars and tanks.
And after the war, when you were demobbed, what happened?
Well, I was... the Polish government sent me to Oxford University. It's a group of about 30 odd of us, Poles, who, it's a small kind of tiny Polish faculty in Oxford, and what was basically connected with studying law and history, I suppose, philosophy. So I was in Oxford for a year and a half. The course wasn't finished because the Polish government lost financial support. What has happened during the German invasion in '39 is that the gold of the Bank of Poland was rescued and actually somehow transported to Britain. I don't know how it was done. But the Polish government had financial support. And in 1946, the gold of the Bank of Poland or whatever, some settlement was made between the British government and the communist government in Poland. And the financial support was, shall we say, evacuated to Poland. So the Poles who remained in this country no longer could maintain it. So after a year and a half, I then sort of started working. And in 1947, I found myself in Glasgow. That's a point, because the Polish government now, believe it or not, has promised me a small pension. I don't know when it will arrive. It might not. But the reason why they said that I might get it is because I acted for the Polish consul. He was an elderly man by then, and he sort of saw that I would be suitable. So I visited Berlin prison to shall we say, to talk to Polish soldiers who got into trouble because he stole something or other. And generally speaking, I sort of interviewed them and pointed out to them the fact that they have acquired a criminal record and they won't be allowed to stay in Britain because of that. And most of them were intending to go back to Poland anyway. But one man was rather upset about it. He had to go back to Poland. He wanted to stay here. I don't know what obviously happened to those people. Incidentally, I got a letter from the Foreign Office sort of advising me that if I decided to go back to Poland, they might not be able to give me any assistance if I required it. But I'm welcome to stay in this country, which I remember at the time I thought it was amusing because I actually intended to stay in this country. Of course, he might have told me that I couldn't, but in fact the Poles just stayed here, those who were in the forces.
And then what work did you then take up?
Well, I worked in 2 different textile factories in which the pay was absolutely atrocious. And I was using up my, I got 70 pounds in 1946. That was quite a bit of money. And I was digging into my money because the pay wasn't sufficient. So anyway, I then found that there was a job blasting tunnels in the Highlands. So I joined the tunnel about a system called the Loch Sloy. If you go along Loch Lomond, you'll actually see the pipes of Loch Sloy still going down. Anyway, high in the hills above it, we blasted very large tunnels to allow the water from the lakes above it that's the hydroelectric schemes in the islands. And we were getting what I at the time thought was very good money, £20 a week.
And then, did you get married soon after that?
Well, I then got a job as a kind of chemist at Dyer. The job is called in a textile factory. And then after a while I met my wife at a wedding. And after, oh yes, this one. That's my engagement present in 1951. Anyway, I eventually married a Glasgow girl, and she had a managerial job. And after a couple of years of marriage, talking to other people about it, we decided I'll go back to university. So I went back to Glasgow University. I did a course in chemistry. I was then advised to do honors chemistry, so I got honors chemistry, and then after that I did another year and I got a MSc in physical chemistry. And then I taught in schools for some years, and then I got an offer of lecturing physics in Vancouver in Canada. So my wife and I emigrated to Canada for several years. And after some years in Canada, incidentally, we were getting older all the time, and he sort of retired back to Scotland. My wife was quite homesick for Canada, but I am used to changing places.
Can I ask you, when did you discover what had happened in Poland? That so many people had died.
Well, I met a man, what's his name? A Jewish man here actually in Glasgow, so actually in Newton somewhere. And he was a genealogist. Genealogist. So I thought I would give him some information about my family that I had, and he took the information, and 2 weeks later he brought me a huge sheet giving me the history of my family. So I sort of, part of what I know personally and part of what I gathered from there. So yes, my family had a long history of rabbis. So the family surname was Etzhaikin. That's Isaac and Chaim combined together made Etzhaikin. And there were 5 rabbis following each other, who were the rabbis in the town. And one of them founded the yeshiva. And that, the importance of that institution is that it's the first actual, call it a college if you wish, in which rabbis are actually trained to perform the rabbinates. Before that, rabbis were sort of picked from among the people. But apparently the Wolozhin yeshiva is the first ever yeshiva, so that, for instance, in New York there is a yeshiva, is known as the Wolozhin yeshiva. It's sort of continuous. And As far as I know, the next one was in the town of Breslau or Wrocław, which is now in Poland. And that was, at that time it was the Habsburg Empire. That was the next yeshiva that was built somewhere in Europe.
Can I ask you, once you were here, did you experience any anti-Semitism here in Glasgow?
Minor. My wife assured me that there is plenty of anti-Semitism. But when I was at university, for instance, some lecturers wanted me included in a group. Since I could speak Russian, they wanted me to come with them, a kind of group of chemists who went to Moscow. I don't remember now the actual reasons for it. But one of the professors was anti-Semitic, I'm quite sure of that. And he didn't want me. This may have been a good idea, because for all I know, I might not have been all that safe. It was still the days of the Soviet Union. So
my last question for you, Moniek.
Mm-hmm.
You've travelled all over the world. Where do you feel you belong?
Strictly speaking, to a minor extent I belong in Britain. I would not say that I belong in Scotland, because I'm not a Scottish nationalist. Incidentally, of the various people I met, I once met a man called Robert Wilkie. Robert Wilkie was the president of the Scottish Nationalists, and I had long talks with him about the possibilities of Scottish independence. This was the days when the Scottish nationalists were Jacobites rather than socialists. But my view is, of course, the one that's frequently being asked, and that is, can Scotland actually manage financially separate from the United Kingdom? And the general calculation is that it will be in deficit to some 1,600, 1,500 pounds for every person in the country. I am not a socialist, and my experience in the barracks, in the prison camp in which we were, in fact, it was the very first prison camp near the Finnish border. Now, I told you there were people suffering from scurvy, and there were 2 people in our barracks who had advanced scurvy. And to be quite truthful, I sort of avoided the corner in which they stayed, tried to keep away from it. Now, we used to get our bread when we came back from work. We worked 10 days with 1 day interruption. In the Soviet Union, they changed on to the 10-day week instead of a 7-day week. Anyway, we would come back from work and would get our bread. Now, this one man would eat his bread, and then he would go and feed the people with scurvy with the bread they used to get. He used to break off the bread and put them in their mouth. The man actually looked after those 2 men with scurvy and kept them alive. And this, to me, was the nearest to what I observed to sainthood. I've seen plenty of the opposite side, but there are people who are prepared to do good just because they feel that that's what they have to do. I don't think it was based on religion in his case. He may have been a good believer in the Orthodox Church, which was or the Pravoslav, it's called church, which was the Russian church, but he didn't do it for religious reasons. He did it because he felt he had to do it.